Good afternoon, and welcome to our breakout section on the Triadic Insight, the Spirituality for the Faith Justice Journey. Father Fred Kammer, S.J., and I will be your presenters this afternoon. My name is Pat Carter Anderson, and I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri, but I currently live in a rural south central Iowa with my husband Larry in a little town called Tracy. I've been a member of Christian Life communities most of my life, serving in various roles on local and national levels, including president of the national organization. In St. Louis, I was involved in the Bridges program, which is the exercises in daily life, again serving in various roles as spiritual director, speaker, and president of the board. I was privileged to be part of two parishes in St. Louis that were focused on social justice and served on the staff of both of them. I am currently serving as a spiritual director, retreat guide, speaker, writer, and a member of the formation team in Christian Life communities. I'm also a gardener, photographer, wife, mother, and grandmother. Fred?
Hi, I'm Fred Kammer. I'm a Jesuit from New Orleans. I grew up here in New Orleans, and I'm actually now at the end of my Jesuit life of wandering around the country. I'm back in New Orleans. I'm the director of the Jesuit Social Research Institute here at Loyola University in New Orleans. And my background is both as a lawyer, a legal services attorney, especially working in Atlanta, Georgia with the Legal Aid Society, and as a Catholic Charities director in Baton Rouge and then nationally. Our institute here at Loyola works on issues of race, poverty, and migration in the context of the Gulf South and through the lens of Catholic social teaching. Pat and I were encouraged to do this breakout session by a mutual friend named Mac Johnson, who's part of the Bellarmine Chapel community at Xavier University in Cincinnati. Pat, maybe you can tell us why you accepted Mac's invitation to get involved in this.
Well, Mac had introduced me to your book, Salted with Fire, and I resonated with Triadic Insight. In Christian Life communities, we've always talked about our three pillars of spirituality, community, and mission. So the Triadic Insight had a familiar dynamic, but yours added the more focused integration into social justice. In my work in faith communities, I often found that individual spirituality and faith sharing communities were often easily to form, but the movement into mission seemed a more difficult leap to take. And in my work with social justice groups, I found that the focus for social justice led to more strategizing when they gathered than faith sharing. And especially in some individuals, the passion was fueled more by unhealed wounds than a transformational spirituality, often leaving a trail of broken relationships. Christian Life Community has more recently been focusing on how the gift of communal discernment is one that can be shared with the broader church and society. And so for me, this Triadic Insight is an example of what I call Trinity energy, where the dynamics of each aspect flow and are integrated into others. I feel this insight addresses some of the issues I mentioned earlier. Then I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself. Fred, would you explain the history and the process which led to the Triadic Insight and what the insight is all about?
Thanks, Pat. The Triadic Insight grew out of a 2-year-long process of reflection in the early 1980s with a dozen Jesuits and others who comprised the National Board of Jesuit Social Ministries and its staff. Each of us was charged with promoting the work of justice in various parts of the country. And in our group were writers and educators, lawyers, community organizers, missionaries, economists, pastors, and administrators. We met together for the better part of a week, 2 or 3 times a year in various parts of the country. The overall process took almost 3 years to complete. Our focus in this process was on 3 issues that had been decided on a few years earlier as advocacy priorities for the National Jesuit Social Justice Office. Those 3 issues were Hispanic social justice concerns, which we focused on at a meeting in San Antonio. Arms peace, what we called arms peace questions, which we focused on in Seattle, which is the home of one of the Trident submarine bases, and Native American concerns, which we looked at together with the Catholic Tecowitha Conference, which is the Catholic Native American Conference, which was being held that year in Denver, Colorado. Our methodology was very intentional. Over the course of a 5 or 6 day meeting, we would have the business meetings that we had to have and the work we needed to accomplish. but we try to do it in the context of praying together, of personal narrative. So telling our own stories of what our experiences were with the particular issue we were dealing with, and trying to mutually support one another in their work. We also tried to stay somewhere where we could prepare our own meals and clean up from our own meals, where we could recreate together and relax together. But critical in our choice of where we met was to have a meeting site that would be close to urban poverty. And also critical was to engage during the course of those days in immersion experiences where we would visit jails, housing projects, public defenders' offices, and spend some time sharing with the local workers for peace and justice, both formally and informally. Despite some artificiality when you come in from away to a particular place, these planned exercises were intended to open us up to more than just intellectual social analysis. To try to put faces and features on the issues, and to enflesh considerations about what we could do back home, which was always at the end of the meeting, or what our national office could do on these priority concerns. The disparate experiences we built into our meetings and our gatherings really involved us in the 4 moments of the pastoral circle. Many of you are familiar with the pastoral circle, which was developed by the Center of Concern in the early 1980s. Basically, it engages in 4 moments. The first is immersion or insertion into the issue and the people that you're working with and whose concerns you're sharing. Second, to do social analysis of what we see, of our experience. Third, to reflect on that social analysis and say, where is God moving? What's graced? What's sinful? And out of that experience, out of the social analysis and theological reflection, to then do your planning and action. The circle is actually continuous, because once you decide on a course of action, that then becomes part of your experience, which then needs to be refined with further social analysis, theological reflection, and planning over time. But all of this was designed to help us develop action at both the regional and the national levels. After we went through this experience of these 3 meetings and these 3 sets of experiences, we asked ourselves a further question. What are the connections between the issues? What's happening in the larger context of the United States that encourages us as a nation to spend enormous sums on implements of war while poor and minority children do not have enough to eat, or decent health care, or hope for their future? That took us to another gathering which we had in the South Bronx. At the time, the South Bronx was a scene of great devastation. It literally looked like a battle zone. But we brought to the South Bronx, including the same process and meeting with people working there, but we brought our 3 issues to ask that of Hispanic concerns, Native American concerns, and arms peace questions. But with that specific question, how do the things we have seen and reflected on during the past 2 years connect to one another? What are the underlying forces that are common to the people we met in different places, which shape their lives even in different environments? To ask these questions honestly, though, we found we had to look inside ourselves, our own families and our local communities, our religious communities, the parishes we belong to, and at the world around us. And we found ourselves beginning to look at 3 different levels or sectors or dimensions of society. They are what the Franciscan Michael Crosby calls the individual, the interpersonal, and the infrastructural. Because of who we were, we particularly asked what was happening in the personal, family, and community lives of those working for justice and peace in the communities that we had visited, the communities of concern we had been with. What was happening especially among those trying to change the structures that oppress one group or another, or that build war instead of peace. In Ignatian and scriptural language, we moved really into theological reflection, asking, where were darkness and light? The when of this conversation, which is important, was the early Reagan years. And the context was his tremendous cutbacks in domestic, social, and human service programs, coupled with awesome escalation of defense spending. We've seen these trends continue ever since then. And for those working among the poor and from poor communities, this period was a period of widespread acute darkness and heart-rending disappointment. But we first looked at the dark side. And there we identified 5 what we called engines of darkness, forces of darkness that cut across all three dimensions of what we had reflected upon. They were operative in the larger social systemic world around us, often in the interpersonal and communal relationships and groups we belong to, and in our own spiritual and individual lives. They were competition, domination, consumption, isolation, and myths, especially the myth of invulnerability. I don't have time really to go into how each of these is operative in all three sectors, but these were the five we ended up settling on as we went through our reflection, and that they were all operative in the larger society, in all sorts of groups and communities, and in ourselves. After that, we asked another question, which was, what were the causal relationships among the five? Was one of them more important than the other? Was one of them primary? Some people argued it's really the economic system, the free market system, and its impact in the larger systemic dimension, and that affects communities and individuals. Other people suggested this was really about human greed and sinfulness, and that was operative really in the personal sphere. Other people proposed that it was a lack of basic experiences of people being loved and having the experience of God's love in the personal and spiritual field. Or others looked to Robert Bellah, his book on Habits of the Heart, on the characteristic of American individualism cutting through all of our culture and all the parts of our world. But then we came to realize that this new task that we had set for ourselves of isolating one key factor was itself part of the problem. It was a source of darkness. That blaming single forces in one of these three spheres, the structural, the communal, the personal, that itself was a source of darkness. Even more, concentrating our efforts to create a better world, that's what came out of this thinking, in only one of these three sectors seemed to us to invite a negative result. What do I mean by this? I'll give you three negative examples. We all knew of experiences of oppressive reformers or leaders in movements for social and economic justice who had really exploited their own friends and families and followers, and whose revolutions became new dictatorships. We see this globally in countries where the leader of a revolution becomes the new dictator. But even on a smaller scale, the people who are very driven by mission and social change, they often burn out their followers because they are so mission focused. And their organizations or movements don't pay attention to the well-being of their followers individually, and learning and helping their followers to learn how to work together as a community or a team or a group effectively. Secondly, we recognize what we call, it's a little cynical, the wine and quiche crowd of community life reformers in religious life and religious congregations who were divorced from the social reality, the reality of the world, and from the personal struggle of individuals. Similar insularity could be found among prayer groups or singles groups in some parishes. They were a form perhaps of what Bellah and his co-authors would later call lifestyle enclaves. Let's just get together and love one another. And lastly, we were well aware also of a kind of spiritual navel gazing, of a kind of false introspection, which is unengaged either with the larger world or a concrete human community. So that was really came out of the sort of analysis and reflection upon the dark side, upon the darkness. So where do we find light? The entry into light and hope was found in the insight that had come from the darkness, that the individual, the communal, and the systemic dimensions of reality were dialectic and interpenetrating. Because the same engines of darkness were operative in all three sectors, addressing them in only one or two sectors would be deceptive and could be self-defeating. Our own personal darkness, spiritual darkness, is tied to that of the world and of others with whom we work. And the world's darkness in that larger world is mimicked in our own hearts. Take competition, for example. I didn't want to go into all five of these, but we have the politics is our politics, even today, has a lot of competition themes, that immigrants are taking our jobs, or Hispanics are taking advantage of Black people, or whatever it may be, that competition is there. But also in our work groups, we often are like competing with one another to see who's doing more about making it a better world, et cetera. And as a result, our personal spirituality is driven by a kind of competition and what I call bootstrap spirituality, where I don't need any help from anybody. I can just pull myself up by my bootstraps. Once we realized that that's the way the darkness operated, we realized that the light, the antidote to the darkness of injustice, lies not in the efforts we exert in the work for justice and peace, or not just in those efforts, but they depended equally on building effective and supportive families and communities and deepening our own spiritual lives. Our response, therefore, has to be three-dimensional, has to be triadic, because the same engines of darkness are operative in all three dimensions, and they reinforce one another across the sectors. We called it then the Triadic Insight, or the Triad. It sounds a little bit like a computer part, but the Triad represents the integral nature of both the evil we confront in the darkness and the quality of light that's necessary to dispel the darkness. The diagram, however, imperfectly, is an attempt to get at the sense of unity and interpenetration of these three dimensions. As we thought more about this, we realized that for pursuers of justice, those of us working for justice in the world, or better dealing with the environment or whatever it is, since we often are already engaged in the struggle in the public sphere, it's important for us to underscore the critical role of the communal and the individual levels. It's there that we're most likely to be negligent and even destructive of ourselves or others. When we act in this way, becoming destructive that way, we're reinforcing the powers of darkness that we're fighting against in the larger world. That's the Triadic Insight. So justice seekers, as they look at the triad, they have to find entry into the triad's light side at the point of building communities. That was our sense. And these are not communities that are focused primarily on their own needs, but they're communities that are concerned about faith and justice. Such an effort involves what Joe Doust, one of our participants, called a community with its face towards the world, looking honestly at social reality around it while simultaneously attentive to the individual journeys of its members and to the quality of their life together. Now, the community level, while it may be the point of entry for people working for justice, is not necessarily going to be the point of entry for others into the triad of individual and communal and systemic light. Certainly not for those whose proclivity is to see faith as a matter of personal or community concern and to divorce the systemic realities. For them, those who tend to the personal or communal, the entry level into the triad is the systemic or social justice level. That needs to be their privileged point of access. And failure on their part to attend to the systemic will allow the powers of darkness operating in the world to influence their personal spirituality and their community life. The Triad Insight was not born in abstract, rational logic or whatever, in some isolated group process, but it had come out of that 2-year process in which we had been engaged across the country. And the social ministry, we had visited a lot of communities of light and hope who were engaged in the common task of building a better society in the larger world, even in the face of overwhelming odds. So for example, in the peace movement in Seattle, there were small communities such as the Ground Zero community of Jim and Shelley Douglas. They were not only passionately engaged in the struggle against war and militarism, but they were living simple and prayerful lives together. In the South Bronx, we found small groups of religious people. We met with them who were working one building at a time to reclaim their neighborhood community, that larger world, from economic and social devastation. We were impressed by their Palm Sunday procession, in which they processed through the very midst of the destruction in their neighborhood in a prayerful embodiment of the rebirth of the new life of Jesus. And in the Native American ministry, we found that religious who were engaged in the Native American ministry, although they were separated by thousands of miles from one another, they had created a letter writing network among themselves to share their struggles with one another and to exchange insights and in effect to build a community among themselves. And finally, while they had not featured in those 3 visits, groups like the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and Catholic worker communities, with whom many of us had worked, had explicitly named community and personal spirituality as goals on a par with and intrinsic to their commitment to social justice. So for many of these different groups across the country, fidelity to one another and prayer were a source of light and hope in the midst of the struggle for a more just society. Accepting the evil and vulnerability in themselves made easier in the context of a supportive community was part of being able to work for justice and even to live in community with one another.
Thanks so much, Fred. And thanks for highlighting the various groups like the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and the Catholic worker communities, who include all three dimensions of the Triadic Insight in their self-identity and mission. One of the challenges is how different groups or communities can adapt the insight to their own mission and purposes. I think of groups giving the spiritual exercises or Christian life communities, which start with the individual transformation, then move into faith sharing groups, but then have difficulty incorporating systemic issues. Mission is often seen as doing direct service rather than addressing the issues that cause the need. If building the kingdom of God was seen from the very beginning of their experience as addressing social justice issues, it would provide a more holistic approach. Louis Avery's book on the spiritual exercises is an example of this.
Pat, I think about student groups like here on the Loyola campus in New Orleans. There's a group called LUCAP, the Loyola University Community Action Program. It's been around for 40 years. And there are many groups like this on our campuses across the country. And I think for them to understand the Triadic Insight, they're already committed to the social justice piece. They need to be conscious of what they need to learn about and how they need to support one another in terms of active listening, in terms of mutual support, because often they're up against very, very powerful negative forces in their local communities or in the world. And they need both the support of a group together that helps them with their work and also a deep spiritual and prayer life to support themselves personally as they go forward.
And when I think of parishes, as I mentioned, the two parishes I was involved with were very involved in social justice issues and also had a pretty good prayer life and community life. But I think many parishes, it becomes, especially the very large ones, going to church on Sunday and events around church are the mainstay of their parish life. And they don't have that sense of the larger, bigger societal issues that they're called to address. And so I think this Triadic Insight might help them to move beyond their own internal needs and functions and being that little community like you talked about before, and seeing that their faith call is to change life and transform our communities and the society in which they work and live on a daily basis.
Now, you made me think of one of the most effective programs in the country on helping people to become aware of the church's social teaching, and that is the JustFaith program, founded originally in Louisville. And there, in a sense, they've inbuilt the three dimensions of the Triadic Insight because there are groups of people who participate. They participate in small groups, so you already have the small group function. There's also an experience of getting out into the community and facing social justice issues, and then they pray over a lot of the materials that they have. And so they're doing this as well. And I think they're another good example as an effective formation program of how to deal with the triad.
And then we look at the basic community, which is our own families. Families are the first faith communities that children grow up in and parents express their spirituality in and share their faith in. And I've witnessed families where the children are exposed at an early age to the social issues of their time in appropriate ways, and help them to engage with people of different colors and ethnicities. And they develop as adults as these wonderfully outgoing, loving people with this world vision of unity and peace that is not always generated in a community, a family that's just centered around its own self.
Yeah, and that's what I think a lot of our schools, high schools and the universities, have been trying to do that in a way within the context of the student community and in the context of immersion programs, so they get people out into the community, but then to reflect upon the reality which they've seen. I want to go back to something I said earlier. One of the things we realize that the triad has three dimensions to it, and that the entry into understanding it and to living in all three dimensions, the way the light moves, is different for different people. For those of us whose first instincts, and I put myself in that category, is to think about the social justice of the world and peace in the world, the insight of the process was that we, people like me, have to pay much more attention to our community life, again, families as well, and to our own interior spiritual life. But that's our spiritual life has to engage the world, and so does our community life as well. But we have to come in through the communal. I think the preferred place or the privileged place we thought for ourselves was to come in through community interaction and community prayer and reflection. Again, for those who are more like prayer groups and spirituality groups, their entry into this is we think anyway, to look at the larger world around us, at the justice and peace challenges that we face in the world around us.
And in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius calls us to this different worldview. Ignatius, he invites us to look at the impact of sin on the world, even from like one person. In the first week, he talks about the impact of one person's sin upon the world. And so he's talking in a way about social sin, even though this was way before the term social sin was ever evolved. And contemplate the world and all its activities, both loving and unloving, as the Trinity does. At the beginning of the second week of the exercises, he has this beautiful image of the Trinity hovering over the world and looking at it and in all its activities and messiness and grace, and deciding to send and to enter more fully into that messiness and grace, and to send Jesus as our Savior, as the person who can show us this love, this unconditional love that God has, its mercy that spreads out. And so that's, I think, our call as Ignatian people, is to look at this world and to contemplate it and to enter more fully into it within our own sphere of influence, but also be aware of how our even small sphere of influence is influenced by the larger sphere of influence that's got there. And so I think that's what the exercises are calling us to in our Ignatian spirituality.
I think when you bring up the incarnation meditation and the exercises, I mean, talk about immersion. When the second person becomes a human being, he is immersed in our lives and in our vulnerabilities. That was one of the other things we were saying about the personal dimension of the triad, is that groups have to be able to recognize that we individually are vulnerable to these forces of darkness as well. And we have to have groups with whom we share and pray that allow us to be vulnerable. The image I often use for what we call the myth of invulnerability is that at masses, everybody prays for other people. No one ever actually acknowledges that they personally need prayer. It's very rare we hear somebody say, I really need the support of this community because I'm going through a very difficult time. We almost never hear that, because that's to acknowledge that we are vulnerable. And so the idea of the triad was that we recognize, like groups have to recognize, is not only the larger world out there of justice and peace questions, but that there are individual journeys that people are on and vulnerabilities that people have that they need to be able to share with one another as they work for a better world and for stronger communities.
Well, thank you, Fred. And I think we're about out of time. So I'm looking forward to the virtual teach-in and the conversation we might have with participants who join us at that time.
Thanks, Pat. I look forward to it as well. Appreciate being with you.
Same here. Bye.